Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Molly O'Toole. I cover immigration and security at the LA Times in Washington, D.C. And I'm just really thrilled to be here today to talk about Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America. It really is an illuminating film about the LGBTQ community, refugees, asylum seekers, and the incredible challenges that they face and overcome, challenges that don't stop even once you win the immigration lottery and make it to the United States. Later, we're going to hear from emerging artist Tito Rey. We're going to hear his new single, Nobody's Illegal. We already heard a snippet of it. It was amazing, so you'll want to stick around for that. So first, we're going to watch the trailer for Unsettled, which follows LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers on their journey from fleeing their home countries to trying to make a new home in the US. And for all the rhetoric that's out there, many people don't not know a lot about how refugee status and asylum actually work, how the sort of arbitrary and cruel US immigration system is actually lived. And we get to see that and witness that through this film. So let's watch and let's learn.
We had to be careful all the time.
They just come and take you from your home and they kill you.
Same-sex sexual relations are illegal in more than 70 countries.
There was this sense of danger all the time. In Congo, they say gay people don't exist.
In Angola, I could never put a foot out of my house. I would get harassed.
Most gay people in Syria, you'll be targeted from everyone, even your family.
Welcome to America. Welcome home.
San Francisco continues to be one of the most expensive places to live in the country.
Moving from place to place, it's like you are still migrating. I don't want to be homeless.
If the asylum officer finds that they're not eligible for asylum, they're placed in removal proceedings.
It could be weeks, even months before we found an attorney for you guys.
My family's still there, and no matter what they've done to me, they're still my family.
At least here, we're not gonna have people calling us name on the street. I think this don't happen here in America, right?
They're going back. They're going back. I'm telling you. They're going back.
I don't want to have regrets. The best lesson was not being angry. The lesson was to make things happen.
Our brothers and sisters in the Middle East and elsewhere need to know that we stand with them.
After everything that I've been through, I'm still alive, and I'm resilient.
We are not afraid anymore.
And to kick off our discussion before we see more clips from the film, I was hoping our experts could give our audience just a cram session in the basics. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there, some of it intentional, about refugees and asylum seekers in general. So I want to start with Rachel. Rachel, can you just explain to our audience briefly what a refugee is and how a person actually gets resettled in any country, much less the US?
Sure, and thanks a lot, Molly. Really wonderful to be with all of you and to be part of this incredible screening. In short, what happens if you are a resettled refugee is that the initiation of the process to get to the US has probably started many, many years previously. You fled home, you probably fled to the country right next door, and you fled for one of 5 reasons: persecution based on your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or this kind of catch-all called your membership in a particular social group. And that's the category that LGBTQ refugees fall in. You apply for protection. In most cases, you're applying to the UN Refugee Agency or the UNHCR. And to get to qualify for resettlement, that agency has to determine that you're not safe in the country that you fled to. You won't be able to find protection there. So instead, you're referred for resettlement. And the truth about resettlement is that less than 1% of the world's refugees, less than 1% of the 80 million people who are refugees today are eligible for resettlement and receive resettlement. So not only do you go through that process with the UN Refugee Agency, but you then have to be processed by the country that agrees to take you. If it's to the US, then you have to go through health checks and checks on your credibility, checks on the basis of your claim. Are you really who you say you are? And very serious security checks that have been introduced over time, and certainly since the start of this administration as well.
And the U.S. has the strictest refugee vetting, in the world, really of any country. So it's obviously not easy to get here. So this is a really good transition, Anna, to you. And I know these issues are complex and they're hard to sort of boil down in just a few minutes. But before we get to the next clip, can you try and help people understand the difference between what Rachel's describing, the process of getting refugee status and then being an asylum seeker? What are some of the key differences, especially in the U.S. immigration system, between refugees and asylum seekers?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for that great explanation of refugees. So the difference between refugees and asylum seekers is location. That's it. So once somebody has been designated a refugee, they're resettled in a specific country, and that's what you see with two of the participants in this movie. So they already have refugee status and they're on a track to towards citizenship. So asylum seekers are in the country in which they're seeking asylum. So they're already outside of their home country. Asylum seekers that we work with are undocumented. And it's like, now you raise your hand to the government and say, I'm seeking asylum in this country. What they have in common is that refugees and asylum seekers are both fleeing persecution.
These are, we like to put people in categories, but these are immigrants who are seeking to enter the United States legally through means that was afforded by US law. But I want to transition really quickly to Steve before there's so much to get into here. But can you talk for a minute about the sort of unique vulnerabilities of the LGBTQ community, of the unique vulnerabilities that asylum seekers and refugees from that community face?
First and foremost, really to put in context, if you think about many other refugees are fleeing because of persecution or violence, other issues in their home country. It often impacts entire families, communities, or countries. So people will flee together. They'll be relocated together with their families, with their broader communities. If you're gay or lesbian or trans, those are often the people that you're trying to flee. They're the people at whose hands you're suffering. More often than not, while governments do persecute as well, more often than not, it's people's communities and even their individual families. And especially if you think about, people rarely get the chance to go from their country of origin directly to a resettlement country like the US or Canada or Western Europe. It's often through an intermediary or what we call a transit country. So if you're coming, for example, from a homophobic place like the Congo or Uganda in Africa, you might very well end up in Kenya, which is one of the only country in the region that accepts asylum seekers on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Or if you're coming from Iraq or Iran or fleeing one of these oppressive regimes, you might end up in Turkey. Again, these aren't exactly welcoming places for LGBT people either. In a lot of places, those same-sex relations are still criminalized, and it's very challenging.
Right, and so you just listed a whole lot of issues that we're going to get into in more depth, but I want to cue up the next clip from the film. This is actually a really great transition because people might think that the United States, and in many ways it is, it's such a safe and supportive place for people from the LGBT community, that while there is still persecution and discrimination compared to some other places in the world, it's pretty open. But what we're going to see in this next clip is Junior from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's a really powerful and heartbreaking example of how the challenges don't stop, once they get to the United States. couple of.
So this page is very important. They talk about all public housing. So here's a phone number to call them and email to answers, hud.gov.
I'm going to contact them.
Yeah, just ask you really urgent, you need an apartment.
You will not sleep on the street. God will not do it.
Be careful.
So this is my husband, Jack. And you have my name, Betsy.
Yeah.
I should come up and rearrange the space for do that before.
Next month I will be moving again to another place. So it's like you are just in process of moving from place to place. It's like you are still migrating, you are still traveling. And
many of our refugees, they need extra time to become acclimated. In Junior's case, the way he looks and presents himself, there's prejudice that he's fighting, and he's had PTSD issues. He has expressed that he recognizes he drinks and he shouldn't drink.
Um, 10 times in his first year in San Francisco that Junior has to move. And it's one of the clips, one of the quotes from the film that actually sticks out to me the most, which is when he says, "It's like you're still migrating." And I think many people might be surprised to see how these challenges don't stop once you're an asylum seeker or a refugee who reaches the United States. Even if you manage to get here, which is so much of a journey in and of itself, those challenges don't stop. So I want to start with Rachel again quickly. Can you talk about some of the difficulties that are faced by refugees once they get to the US?
I think one thing to know about the resettlement program is that most people who are resettled in the US are resettled together with family members, and they may join family members who are already in the US. And so there's that immediate support that's provided to refugees who arrive with family members here. Most, though not all, LGBTQ refugees arrive on their own. And there is, as you said, sort of an intricate system for distributing the resettlement slots that are available. And they're usually distributed with the support of a local agency. So HIAS has affiliated organizations across the US. In the East Bay, we work with a wonderful organization called the JFCS of East Bay, Jewish Family and Community Services, that has a great group like Oasis of caseworkers that really know what it means to work with LGBTQ refugees and meet folks where they are at and try to serve them and create safe spaces for them, including finding shelter. That can be challenging. In cities where there is a large and welcoming LGBTQ community, there is also often very, very high rents, like San Francisco, like New York, like other big cities across the US. So the real challenge is finding that sweet spot where you've got an agency with staff who are literate in working with LGBTQ refugees, who get what your needs are and can meet you where you are at. It's shelter, it's education, and it's finding work. And on top of that, it's finding community so that you can bridge the gap of your initial arrival and really put your feet down and find a place that you can call home.
And I want to talk more about sort of how politics can play into that too, is sort of finding that sense of community. But first I want to get to Anna to talk about what some of the challenges are for asylum seekers who get in the United States, but specifically and more directly, asylum has really been a target for this administration. You have President Trump has referred to it as a hoax or a con job. And there have been all these steps that have been taken to try and make it more difficult for asylum seekers, even after they're here, trying to get them to wait longer to work, for example, sort of these quote unquote wealth tests that also impact refugees, sort of having to prove that they're not going to use public services. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that these communities have been targeted, and this is even after they arrive in the US. So can you talk about some of those challenges for asylum seekers trying to make their way especially during what can be a very drawn out process. Anna.
I can. Could we extend this panel for another 3 hours?
I know I'm asking such big questions, and we're going to talk to the audience too, so you'll have to help me limit you.
I'll do my best. I guess one big issue that I think is really important to educate people on is that so when you're an asylum seeker, as we discussed, you come to this country, you have no status yet. There is a law that says you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of arrival. There are ways to get around that law, but what we're seeing with LGBTQ asylum seekers, it is extremely difficult for them to apply within that year for all the reasons that Rachel and Steve already touched on, which is that they, when they come here, they're not out and proud. They've been dealing with decades of bullying, sexual abuse, rejection, physical abuse, for their sexual orientation or gender identity from their entire community, especially by family members who are the people who are supposed to support you. So when they come to the US, they're not, investigating how can I apply for legal status? How can I get the right to work? They're just trying to survive. And most of our clients have suffered really extreme trauma and a lifetime of trauma resulting in PTSD, and having to function is enough of a challenge, and then having to seek legal help on top of that is just a really difficult burden, because in the process you have to talk about what happened to you in your past, and that is extremely re-triggering, and you've basically learned to never trust people.
I want to give Steve a chance to weigh in here very quickly, and then we are going to get to a question from the audience, I promise. Steve, I mean, I myself, I'm from California. San Francisco is one of the sort of most liberal cities in the country, in the world. I mean, were you surprised when you watched this documentary and sort of saw what the experience of refugees and asylum seekers were in this city, that sort of this mecca for the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, sadly, not entirely surprised. I think, there are invisible minorities within the LGBTQ community here in the US, and refugees and asylum seekers are certainly part of that. As Anna alluded to, it's sometimes hard for them to plug into the culture and community. Things are truly foreign to them. LGBTQ refugees, asylum seekers are often so traumatized, and including the years that they spend in camps or in shelters in transit countries, whether it's Mexico or South Africa like Junior did, or Turkey, where a lot of those wounds are just are suffered and experienced again and again. And so they often don't come with the emotional and tools to deal with a lot of the transition, which just makes it harder.
And we're the next clip, this actually just perfectly cues up the next clip with Mari and Cheyenne, a couple from Angola, but really quickly from our audience, and I'm going to limit each of you to one. You get one response because we got to get to that clip. But from our audience, Amelia Salazar asked this question. I know it's a big one, so this is going to be difficult to just give one example, but she wants to know, what are some organizations that help people in these circumstances? So if you could each name one organization that's not yours. Ready, go. You want to start, Rachel?
Sure. I was just going to mention the group that I already mentioned in my answer, which is Jewish Family and Community Services in the East Bay, which works with resettled refugees with a special focus on LGBTQ refugees. And they've been in this area for many, many years, working with communities to find shelter and support in all different ways there.
Anna?
Yeah, I endorse them heartily. We work really closely with JFC East Bay, great organization. My one organization would be Immigration Equality in New York. Besides Oasis, they're sort of the other big organization that focuses on LGBTQ asylum service providers in the US.
Steve?
And I would throw out Rainbow Railroad, which is a great Canadian-based organization that focuses specifically on the piece of moving people to safety from the country where they are at, whether it's country of origin or transit country, to a resettlement country. And we're developing a partnership with them. And they did a lot of work on getting gay refugees out of Chechnya and to safety. So really great organization.
All right, so some great organizations. You've got a running list of organizations at this point, but let's watch this clip from Mari and Cheyenne that really just even touches the surface of the trauma of what they experience at home, fleeing home, and then trying to make a new home.
Nobody will go to the police because they're scared. So what you gonna do? You're gonna fear for your life? You're not gonna feel safe to go and report something that is happening to you.
You're gonna need more detail. The asylum person, he's not in your head. Now, a lot of it's here, but they're gonna wanna hear it from you.
I moved in with Marie. Her mother didn't like the situation. She brought some cooked food for us, so we ate. In the middle of the night, we woke up sweating, like with diarrhea, really bad vomiting. And like it was really, we thought we would die because it was really, really bad, really bad.
It was the same day that she said, I wish I would leave you for adoption. I wish you were never born. Yeah, things like that.
Anna, let me start with you. You quoted this sort of amazing success rate at Oasis, this 99% success rate at winning asylum, especially for members of the LGBTQ community. And I know as a reporter on these issues that it's actually very difficult to win asylum for anyone, much less members of the LGBTQ community. So and when we saw in that clip there what they would have to go through in one of these interviews in this long process, can you talk a little bit about how difficult it is to get asylum in the United States, and in particular for this community that the asylum system hasn't always been a great fit for?
It's very hard, as we talked about, for people, come here not trusting really anybody, because typically they have not seen support from anybody in their community, from anybody in their family. So it just takes a lot to build up the trust to reach out. Typically, our clients do not have a high school education, they're low income, they don't speak the language. So there are just so many barriers to access legal services, and as Steve and Rachel talked about, very hard for them to access the resources to put themselves out there. So much of it is still word of mouth, which is very difficult because that's not going to happen until you build up a community. We just also really important to be with an organization that has expertise in a specific area, because we often hear from clients that they were turned off by a private attorney or even another nonprofit, sad to say, that isn't an expert in this field, because they felt the person was not sensitive to their sexual orientation or gender identity, or didn't really understand the field. We see tons of people getting turned away by organizations because they didn't file within a year. And so people think that's not a winnable case, but it is. Over 80% of our clients do not file within the first year, and half of our clients don't even file for asylum within the first 10 years of being in the US. And these are all overcomable hurdles if you know how to do it.
Steve, you got into this a little bit before, but I'm hoping you can get into it a little bit more. We've sort of focused on the situation once they get into the United States. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen outside the United States in terms of sort of ongoing persecution against the LGBTQ community? And in this circumstance, in the clip, Mari and Cheyenne are talking about discrimination from her mother, from her own family. I know you touched on that, but can you talk about it a little bit more, about what you've seen outside the US?
Sure, absolutely. We do a lot of work in Kenya. We're also working on the Mexico side of the U.S. border and in other geographies. But like I mentioned before, a lot of the discrimination that people face and violence is at the hands of their own family. People will flee their country because there's no place, even their family put a hit out on them. There's no place safe for them. I actually met, believe it or not, LGBTQ refugees in Uganda, of all places. They had, you think, well, how bad is it where you live that you would just a place like Uganda, which was considering a kill the gays bill, but, they come from places like Burundi and the Congo and, fit for some kind of safety and security. And one other point I would add is just that, as we talked about earlier, resettlement slots sadly have really dried up around the world, especially here in the U.S., as you know, with less than 18,000 people getting resettled to the U.S., which is a fraction of the lowest it's been in modern history. And so people are waiting longer and longer years now in transit countries trying to get resettled.
Really quickly, I want to go to Rachel and give her an opportunity to answer a question from the audience. Sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to cut you off. And obviously we've seen officials in the United States use coronavirus as a pretext to pursue some of these goals that they had. We know one of the big differences for refugees, but for asylum seekers in particular, who have to go through this legal process once they arrive, Rachel, having a lawyer, having access to legal services, it makes all the difference. If you are represented or if you're not, your odds of winning asylum go up dramatically. So can you just talk about, the question from the audience is, how do people get connected with these legal services given how important they are and sort of how behind they already are once they arrive in the United States and they don't have that community or those resources yet?
I mean, you'd be surprised how resourceful asylum seekers and refugees are accessing the few services that are available. It's absolutely true that legal services make a huge difference in the chances that you're granted asylum or refugee status in any country that you're in. And there have been multiple studies in the US and all over the world that show that through statistics and evaluation of data out there that indicates that. I know that, the work that I've done, the work that HIAS does globally to provide legal services, certainly at the US-Mexico border, we're in Costa Rica doing it, we're in Greece doing it, in Israel providing these services. In all of those countries, asylum seekers spread the word through the community on what resources are available and how to find access to a lawyer. So, COVID-19 has made access to communities very, very difficult. It's made it hard for people to access services because they've been cut off from the work that they need to secure the funds to get the transportation to the offices that provide those services. So what we're doing and what many, many other offices are doing globally is to reach people remotely through Facebook, through Instagram Live, through phone banks, through just texting. But in normal circumstances, word gets out in the community and you've got a line out the door. And the issue is not how do people find you, but how do you have enough resources, have enough lawyers to serve the many, many needs of the asylum seekers who present themselves at your office?
The lack of access just leads to these really, Kafkaesque situations. I was in immigration court watching an unrepresented defendant who was 6 years old. His feet didn't even reach the floor. He's from El Salvador, doesn't speak English, and the judge refers to him as a respondent. It's just really a huge problem.
The sort of catch-22s of the U.S. immigration system. You have a right to a lawyer, but there are all these obstacles that have been put in place to actually prevent you from accessing that lawyer or talking to that lawyer, accessing those services, because having a lawyer makes such a difference. And the example you highlighted with the child, and we do know, there have been many examples under the cover of coronavirus specifically, where the Trump administration has been trying to target unaccompanied children who are showing up at the border, who are seeking asylum, because U.S. law has special protections for children. And so that example that you raised in the court, I think, is actually, it's a good transition to this next clip. I mean, what the film does so powerfully is it gives some of that humanity back to systems that can be so dehumanizing, that can refer to a 6-year-old as a respondent, this sort of clinical term. In this next clip, in what it can be a very heavy documentary, a very intense film, it's actually kind of a moment, it's a moment of triumph in a way, because we see Subi from Syria in this sort of transition he makes, obviously someone who also suffered discrimination from his own family, a country that has gone from a country that's gone through so much, but he has this amazing moment that we're all going to get to witness here. So let's watch that clip.
Wow. Is there simultaneous interpretation, or is it...
There'll be interpretation in people's earpieces.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, good.
Hi. Pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you as well. Thank you so much for coming and being here. Thank you for really important. Hi.
Hi, Neil Greengrass. It's
Hi.
a pleasure.
Good to meet you. Do you have any questions about the session or anything?
No, I don't. I cannot think of any question at the moment.
How does it feel for you to be here at the UN?
You're very nervous.
What are you nervous about?
Everything today. The speech, meeting you, the speech, yeah.
That's okay. We got that out of the way.
Yeah.
Hundreds of years from now, people will look back on this and they will think it's a historic step that you took, and your family will be very proud. It may take some of them some time, but
yeah,
that's how history gets made. So we haven't really played up your family history and your story. We didn't want to, cause any particular danger to anybody who's living behind.
Why don't you put it in?
I'm just going to speak up.
Ready, Miss House?
Not all alone.
Thank you.
If you get scared or nervous, make eye contact with Fred, okay?
Oh my God. My name is Subhi Nahas. I'm a refugee and I am gay. I'm here to recount to you what I experienced and witnessed as a gay man in my country. In the name of all vulnerable refugees, I urge you to heed this plea. LGBT is not just a terminology invented by the West itself, but there is an LGBT community in the Middle East and in Africa, and they stand together and they want their right too.
When I see this clip, I think a lot about actually the run-up to the 2016 election and the sort of political context here. I remember at the time, even among the Democratic presidential candidates, but as well as the Republican presidential candidates, there was this sort of debate whether the refugee ceiling needed to be brought down and whether you could sort of risk bringing in Syrian refugees because of this sort of implication that somehow they posed an additional security risk because their country was being, ravaged by war, by the Islamic State. And the U.S. had its own involvement there militarily. And I just think a lot about that because it was Democrats and Republicans alike. And in many ways, it set the stage for Donald Trump to sort of emerge as this unlikely Republican candidate. So, almost 4 years later, we look at a situation in which the refugee cap is not even going to reach likely 18,000, which is what it was set at for this year. And you have the president's aides who actually wanted it to be zero. You have asylum in many ways targeted on all sides, the border effectively closed in the name of coronavirus, including to asylum seekers. I just sort of want to open this up to all of you, just sort of bring us up to speed, listening to Subi's clip, how far have we come and how far do we have to go in terms of the United States and the role it plays in the world for refugees and asylum seekers.
We're really reaching a low here in our history, not only of immigration overall, but I would say what's really unprecedented is this attack on legal immigration. As you said, that is really new under this administration. And besides just a constant, barrage of bad interpretations and bad rules coming down the pike at us, what we're also seeing is sort of an attempt to sabotage the law as it is. I mean, we saw that with the DACA ruling by the Supreme Court, which the administration's response to a ruling that was not in their favor was to just sort of say, okay, well, we're just not going to issue and look at new petitions. And it's that kind of sort of neglect that is causing a lot of damage. I have a nice little graph. Sorry for not being able to screen share, but this is was just in a
what are we looking
at to Congress from the Ombudsman, but it shows the affirmative asylum backlog. So these are all people who have applied for asylum in the U.S. and are waiting for a hearing. And you can see, well, probably just the shape of it is all you need. But in 2012, there were 15,000 pending applications. And now there are over 350,000 asylum seekers waiting to be heard. It's just, it's bleak right now. I'm not going to lie. We've had decades of established protection for asylum seekers in general and LGBTQ asylum seekers in particular is just being completely eviscerated.
Rachel, Steve, anything you want to add to sort of where we are, just to, 80 days from the 2020 election and where we've come since in the last 4 years on these issues?
Yeah, I think I'll build on what Anna was saying and just touch on the resettlement side of it. Under the last administration, the presidential ceiling for the number of refugees to come into the US was set at 110,000. And this year, we're not able to reach that 18,000 mark. And what that's meant has been very powerful, both for the lives of individuals affected, the tens of thousands of people who could not enter the resettlement pipeline and be eligible and have the opportunity to restart their lives in the US in safety and in dignity, including the many, many LGBTQ refugees whom I know so many people on this call care so deeply about. And the other piece of it that I think is critical is that we've lost the strength and the moral leadership that we play in the world as a nation to other countries around the world on the issue of creating safe spaces and welcoming refugees. Because we're not doing that, we cannot say to Kenya, when it comes time to creating safe spaces for LGBTQ Ugandans and Congolese, you've got to step up, because we do not have the moral authority to do that. And that plays out multiple times in multiple countries around the world, where we simply can't encourage those countries to do what's right and to create a welcoming environment and create the legal infrastructure and the service infrastructure to help people who have lived their lives in persecution and need to find safety. So it has this very personal impact on the lives of the thousands of refugees who are unable to leave a situation where they are truly unprotected. And it also means that we've really stepped back from a powerful role that the US had played internationally in leading in this very important area.
It makes me think of the recent examples and reporting we had from Greece, how they're just dropping people off in the Mediterranean toward Turkey, without engines in lifeboats that the New York Times had reported, or even a few years ago when Kenya once again threatened to close Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world, sort of invoking the United States position. And so what you talk about is really important. There's a tangible impact on people's lives, which we see so powerfully in this documentary. And then there's the sort of the symbolism of the United States, and that too translates to tangible impacts on a more global scale. Steve, what do you think? 2020?
Yeah, I feel there's some parallels to the LGBT equality movement here in the US, and it is a series of one step forward, two step back, or it feels that way. And I remember vividly, you know, the day that President Obama got elected in November 2008, which had been a day of huge celebration, was also a day of mourning because we had a debate here in California, and the right to marriage for same-sex couples was taken away, and it was just such a gut punch, and we had to redouble our efforts. And I feel like that is where we're at in some ways, and kind of a retrenching in terms of asylum and refugee work. What gives me hope, though, are the LGBT asylum seekers and refugees themselves. They're incredibly resilient. I think that that things like Subi speaking at the United Nations create such a specter of hope, and that even though we're in a dark time, I would say right now, you know, I think that there's hope out there, and that there's this collective belief that we can all pull together and change it again. So try to end on a bit of a positive note there.
Yeah, no, I think that connection between the movement for really civil rights for LGBTQ community in the United States, and sort of the how long that took, but it's sort of in the arc of history, like really kind of incredible, the change that's happened in attitudes, in perceptions, in the law, in the systems that we have in the United States just within a generation is really incredible. And that's really interesting to think about for 2020 and whatever happens next, if there will be a sort of parallel movement with the civil rights of immigrants, refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and sort of changing attitudes. That's really fascinating to think about, and is a really, really good transition. Again, you guys are doing my job for me in a way that I don't even have to do. I'm going to transition to Tito Ray, giving an introduction to this amazing emerging artist here. I can't wait for everyone else to hear his first single, Nobody's Illegal. Welcome, Tito. Before your performance, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about this song, and our panelists and myself will sort of graciously bow out here.
Of course, Molly. Thank you so much for having me. This film means so much to me. I cried so much when I watched it. I am an immigrant from Chile. I came here and something happened and I became undocumented. I wrote this song about my experience being undocumented in the United States, and I'm gonna sing it for all of you now. I hope you like it. My grandfather told me to never give up, 'cause if you keep walking, you get to the top. So I left my country, I packed my bags, my dreams and my passport, and never looked back. Now I'm in the States, I'm in LA, no family. All I see is fakes and people pretend that they know me. And the government says that I shouldn't be here, but how far I've come, they don't got no idea. I'm gonna stay, and I'm gonna make it. Nobody, 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 nobody's illegal. Nobody, 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 nobody's illegal. Tired of always living in fear that one day they'll find me and then I'll disappear. So I live in silence with my hope and my dreams that one day I'll make it and my family near. And the government says that I shouldn't be here. How far I've come, they don't got no idea. I'm gonna stay, I'm gonna make it. Nobody, 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 nobody's illegal. Nobody, nobody, nobody,
Wow, thanks, Tito. That's just amazing. And I love the connection between your song and the title, Nobody's Illegal, and the sort of message of the documentary, of the film, that really brings that humanity that sometimes is missing. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. Everyone in the audience, you can connect with Tito at titoray.com. Make sure you do. And I think that just about wraps us up here. Thank you to World Channel, to our distinguished panelists, and especially you, the audience, for joining us. You can watch the full film beyond these clips at worldchannel.org and pbs.org. It's free until Friday, August 20th, and I believe it's also going to be screening again the week before the 2020 presidential election in November. To get more involved with the film or these issues, you can visit unsettled.film. And thank you so much again. And I think that's it. Thanks so much.